Auto workers spending the week on the picket line. Strikes are in full swing for UAW workers at Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis, with one expert warning it could cost the U.S. economy $5 billion. Yahoo Finance has you covered with your extensive coverage of the strike.
Well, it's day 4 of the United Auto Workers strike against the big 3 Detroit automakers, and things are escalating. UAW President Shawn Fain recently saying that if the union does not get better offers, they're going to, quote, amp this thing up even more. On the other hand, the companies are announcing temporary layoffs, with Ford telling 600 workers not to report to work at a Michigan assembly plant, and 2,000 GM workers in Kansas are expected to be out of work this week. We want to discuss what this means for the EV transition. For that, we want to bring in Nathan Bomey, Axios business reporter, as well as Micheline Maynard, a journalist and author. Great to have you both here. So let's just start when we talk about the fact that this could potentially delay the transition that we could see to EVs. Nathan, how imminent, how real is that risk?
I don't think it's imminent, but it certainly is a risk in the long term. If the automakers come out of this hobbled, they'll be delayed on all products, and that will certainly affect electric vehicles. I think their long-term concern for the automakers is that they come out of this with higher labor costs, which makes it more difficult to make EVs at a price point in which people can afford. But the UAW says that, the automakers can afford it because they have profits that they've been racking up over the last several years, and that it's time to give some of that back.
Micheline, how would this create pressure for the supplier channels that these automakers have as well, given the fact that if they have to make sure that they're paying a higher wage to so much of the union and for the workers that are negotiating and realizing how their jobs are going to change? On the other side of this, automakers are going to have to try and figure out where they can offset some of those wage increases as well.
Right. I think the wage issue is very important for both the main automakers and the suppliers, especially some of the suppliers are unionized, but a lot of them are not. And so there will be pressure on the car companies to cut costs wherever they can. And whenever they've cut costs in the past, they've looked offshore in order to find cheaper sources of materials, parts, and labor.
Ethan, how much of an advantage does Tesla have in a situation like this?
Well, they already have an advantage of about maybe $15 or $20 an hour, according to the companies. That's on labor costs. And so the question is, how much wider is that gap going to grow? Tesla has some other advantages. Obviously, the fact that they have, been way ahead on EVs. And so they're getting more and more efficient in the manufacturing process. And so that's also an advantage. But, I think that certainly this is going to advantage Elon Musk in one way or another. But GM, Ford, and Stellantis certainly have significant electric vehicle programs, and they've made a lot of progress. But right now, they're pretty concerned about losing an edge. The question here is which side can extract blood first. I think that they both kind of have to show their constituents that they fought really hard, that they've taken a bite out of the other side. And it's not until that they can prove to their people that they've done that this will probably be resolved.
Micheline, we're looking at a far more robotic, even, dare I say, augmented intelligence type of facility that's producing so many of these millions of vehicles across the auto manufacturing landscape. And so how is that coming up, or how is that expected to also play a role within these negotiations?
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the things that the UAW is very concerned about is job security, and not only job security for the veteran workers, because they've been offered buyouts in the past. And probably what will come out of this set of negotiations is, if you want to take a buyout, if you have enough seniority, this might be a good time to take one. But they are very concerned about the younger workers that have been hired. So just to give you an example, a veteran worker makes about $32 an hour in wages. The younger workers make about $17 an hour in wages. And what the union is asking for is for those younger workers to be bumped up faster. But then they run into this prospect that we will have AI and we will have more robotics, and the car companies are going to figure out ways to streamline things. And remember, when you have electric vehicles, you're not putting engines in them, and engines take a lot of components. And so that's an area where the UAW could easily be looking at job losses.
Nathan, I know you've been reporting on this for some time. You've been talking to a number of players within the industry. What are you hearing just in terms of how long the strike could potentially go on for, and maybe some of the asks that the automakers would be a little bit more open to when they're trying to reach some sort of agreement?
I mean, it's anybody's guess, but I think it's very difficult to see how this gets resolved within days. It feels more like weeks. And I mean, I can't rule out months because the two sides just seem so far apart on benefits in particular. I think on wages, they're starting to get closer. You know, the UAW, I think now wants a 36% pay increase and the automakers are at 20 or 21%. That gap is starting to shrink, but benefits is where they're really far apart. I mean, the UAW wants a return to more traditional pensions and retiree health care, and the automakers say that's absolutely not going to work.
And so just kind of broad strokes here, the impact to the economy that we may see as a result of an extended shutdown or strike, especially given that we had the Teamsters last week also step up, throw their hat in the rings and say, well, hey, we're not going to cross the picket lines either, Nathan. You know, what kind of anticipated impact does that spell out?
I think in the immediate term, probably not a big impact because we're only talking about 3 plants. We know that there could be an additional plant for GM that goes offline because of the first 3. But I think the impact starts to widen considerably if the UAW expands the strike, which they've threatened to do.
Micheline, we know the Biden administration tapping Gene Sperling here, helping to try to really accelerate some of these talks now for quite some time. We haven't seen too much movement there. Do you think we are going to see maybe a different tone from the Biden administration as they travel to Detroit to try to get a better handle of the situation?
Well, I was very surprised to see the president weigh in on the strike so early. We've definitely had presidents in the past who expressed concern, but they haven't sent advisors to Detroit. Actually, Gene Sperling lives here, so it isn't a very far trip for him to come. But to tap 2 advisors to oversee these negotiations, or at least kind of sit on the sidelines and watch them, I mean, that's real pressure from a presidential administration. And so I have a sense that I agree with Nathan that this could drag on for a while, but I don't think it's going to drag on months. I think there's too much political danger for the administration if this goes on. And the other thing to remember is a lot of unions around the country are expressing solidarity. People are showing up to picket, sort of friendly, join the picket lines. And so if we see a union movement across the country that really puts pressure on the 2 sides to settle, I think that will be a factor as well.
If we did see a broader union movement, where else could this kind of overflow into further from here? Because, I mean, we've already seen large negotiations and strikes also have to come forward, whether that be on the entertainment side, whether that be in the auto side, several different capacities, even as we're thinking about fulfillment, areas where there hadn't been unionization. Where do you believe, Micheline, that there could be more of an effort derivative of what we're seeing play out right now?
This is a real year for the labor movement. And I have to be honest, I mean, I'm a 3rd generation union member. I'm a member of the News Guild and the Lecturers Union at the University of Michigan. And even as somebody who's watched labor basically my whole career, I've never seen anything like this. And so I think the sympathy of labor movement members, especially younger people, if you look at the Starbucks baristas and how much sympathy they've gotten, I mean, this could spread in a number of different directions. And it's just really fascinating to watch. I've never seen anything like this before.
All right, Nathan Bomey and Micheline Maynard, thank you both so much for taking the time here today and discuss this very important topic. We'll see how much longer this plays out for. We appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, negotiations have continued today between the UAW and the car makers, and as yet there's been no resolution in sight. The union leader, Shawn Fain, today warning that they are going to amp up the strike action, threatening to hold picket lines at more sites as part of their selective strategy. Currently, the walkouts have taken place at 3 locations, Missouri, Ohio, and Michigan. But where will the UAW hit next? That's the big question we're asking today. Let's bring in Kevin Roberts, Director of Industry Insights and Analytics at Car Gurus. Set things up for us right now, where things stand, Kevin. We're talking about 3 plants. Where's the next step you think UAW is looking at that could really amp up the pressure on the big 3?
So the UAW is attempting a new strategy this time around at doing a stand-up strike. So they're kind of keeping some, uncertainty out there. So I would say we don't really know where they're going to strike next. We don't know when it could be. But I do want to mention that while we do know the 3 plants that have already been struck, we're already starting to see some trickle-down effects. And GM's already come out and said that one of their plants is additionally going to be impacted by the plant that's already been struck. So we're already starting to see some trickle-down effects from strategies that UAW is employing.
And Kevin, just to double tap on that strategy, because you bring up a point, it's different, right? They're not going after one company; they're kind of going after all three companies here with these targeted strikes. Talk about why they adopted that strategy. What's the point of that, Kevin? Is it just to keep the big three kind of on their toes and uncertain about where they could be hit next?
Yeah, I think it's meant to kind of keep that uncertainty on the OEMs and try to keep them at the negotiating table and try to get a better offer for the UAW.
Kevin, there's questions about what the ripple effects are going to be, sort of beyond where things stand right now. There's some reporting out of CNBC that points to potential for 18 facilities that could be closed from Stellantis. I mean, is that part of sort of a negotiating tactic, if you will, with the companies saying, look, we understand what you're looking for, but there are effects that could come out of that?
Yeah, there's definitely effects that can come down the road. I kind of see three real paths that they could really take on this front. One is they can target the vehicles that have vehicle plants that have the least availability of vehicles right now. We're already starting to see that with some of the plants that were targeted. Ford Ranger and GMC Canyon already have some pretty light day supply of inventory. And so we're already starting to see inventory levels for those vehicles start to decline a little bit more quickly. Conversely, they could go for the vehicles that have the highest profit margins, but those vehicles tend to have more kind of day supply or inventory out in the marketplace. And the third kind of option is you could go towards the powertrain plants where they produce the engine transmissions and kind of get kind of a wider impact out into the marketplace by targeting just those plants.
And Kevin, it's really an interesting moment where this is all unfolding, right? Because you have these big three, the industry, they're making this transition to EVs, electric vehicles, away from gas-powered cars. Just talk about the moment here and how perhaps this UAW strike, how it complicates that picture for these companies going forward.
Yeah, I mean, you've already heard a lot of the automakers come out and say that the transition to EVs is going to be expensive, and they're trying to really improve the profitability of the electric vehicles out there. Obviously, if you're increasing your labor costs, it's going to potentially reduce some of those profit margins out there for the automakers, and that's going to create some issues out there. Conversely, you're going to have a decent number of U.S. built vehicles that aren't built at UAW plants that could potentially have lower profit margins, or have higher profit margins out there because they have lower labor costs out there, or could provide the automakers opportunities to reduce the price of those vehicles to be a little bit more competitive in the marketplace.
So, Kevin, on that point, I mean, how should we be thinking about the beneficiaries? We've heard Tesla being thrown out a lot, but obviously a lot of the Ford car makers do produce here in the U.S. and they're non-union. They use non-union labor, non-union markets. Which one of those names are you watching closely that you could see potential inroads being made the longer this strike continues?
So I think most automakers who aren't impacted right now, so basically non-Detroit 3 automakers, stand to potentially benefit in the marketplace. We're coming out of a situation where the industry is still recovering from the semiconductor shortage. New vehicle prices are up significantly higher than what they were from a pre-COVID level. The availability of vehicles is much less than it was, say, in 2019, the last time there was a strike. And so, if you have vehicles available on lots, it really creates an opportunity to take advantage of that. And additionally, in our latest consumer survey, 73% of shoppers reported being open to several brands. And so, again, if a vehicle is not available or you're going to have difficulty ordering that vehicle, it really presents an opportunity for other automakers to take advantage.
And Kevin, finally, I want to talk to you about the Biden administration here and their role. Obviously, President Biden, he considers himself pro-labor. He's pro-union. He's talked very openly about how big corporate profits, he says, should mean big corporate contracts. They're involved here. To what extent do you think the Biden administration can help break this stalemate?
I can't really speak to political strategy, but I think considering the impact a prolonged strike could have on inflation levels and local economies, it's safe to say the situation stands to extend beyond the auto industry, and the quicker we can resolve this situation, the better.
The strike against the big three automakers enters its fifth day, with the deal still elusive. The UAW warning over more action if, quote, serious progress is not made. Union reps say they received no new offers from GM, Ford, or Stellantis since it laid out its proposals on September 14th. Stellantis says it has resumed negotiations, however, citing constructive discussions. On Friday, 9% of the union's nearly 150,000 members, they downed their tools. And joining us now with her take on what sets these strikes apart is Erica Groshin, Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations Senior Economic Advisor. Erica, thank you for joining us today. What do you make of the latest here?
Well, in some ways, it's not terribly surprising. We certainly have a very strong labor market, a very strong economy, and strike activity usually rises when the economy and the labor market are strong. So we have the immediate conditions. And then we are in a time of technological change, say for entertainment professionals, the growth of generative AI. For auto workers, we're talking about the move to electric vehicles and robotics. So that's at play. And the administration is more friendly to organized labor. That helps. So we have a lot of things that suggest that we're going to have labor market activity, and that they're probably behind a lot of what we're seeing.
So, Erica, we saw a summer of strikes, and basically this is heading over into the fall now with a lot of different kind of sectors of the economy. Now UAW threatening that their strike could expand on Friday if, there's not more serious progress, quote, made. What is the expectation for the impact to the economy from your view, especially if these strikes continue to extend out?
Well, so, I mean, as an economist, I always say on the one hand, on the other hand, right? So here we go. I mean, this actually could be good if it ushers in an economic period like we had during the 1960s when unionism was more widespread and there was more activism. But this was a period with very high productivity growth, improved living standards for all workers, less inequality than we see now. So it could be turning a corner to get back to some of the salient features that we've had before. On the other hand, of course, it could be bad if we see labor strife without creative cooperative solutions to workplace issues, which of course include pay and benefits, but also training, working conditions, worker voice like that. And then there's always a possibility that's neutral. This is just a flash in the pan, and we go back to the trends that we were on for a long time. So I think the jury's still out, but there is potential for this to actually be a force for creativity and cooperative solutions going forward.
And how do we foster that? How do we engender that, given the sides, everybody seems to be at odds here, and also the state of the economy kind of plays to this as well. We've seen a high number of strikes recently. These things tend to happen when times are good. Maybe talk to us about the state of the economy and how that influences these discussions.
Well, workers see that corporate profits are high, particularly in the industries they're looking at, so that they understand that they're not going to be driving their employers out of business, right? That this is more about sharing the pie. All right, so that, that contributes, workers knowing that they have alternatives in the labor market, that if they leave this job, that they can probably find something else is important. So those things play into the calculus behind, a rational calculus on the part of workers to decide whether they want to be more active. Unionization in the U.S. is still on the decline, so we haven't seen an increase in unionization. What we've seen, and it's really only since July, is this big increase in work days idled because of strikes. And we do have a slight increase in the number of strikes, but it's mostly long strikes. So the workers are feeling empowered and willing to stay out long enough to get the kinds of deals that they think they deserve.
And Eric, I want to ask you one just kind of final thought that it's something that we haven't given much thought, or we haven't had conversation about this, you and us. Just the prospect of AI and the threat that could mean for union workers. Is that a concern that you've seen in your research, and kind of a looming factor over this particular striking sector, the UAW?
Well, I'd say that the implications of AI are perhaps clearer for the entertainment workers than for the UAW workers, although I'm not close enough to know if there's some issues there with them as well. But it comes down to this idea of are the workers at the table when the companies make their choices on how they're going to implement changes, right? Or are these decisions being made far away from the workers without any input from the people who are closest to the shop floor and really understand the processes involved? So in other countries, say Germany, there are mechanisms in place in all of these companies for that voice. And in a lot of American workplaces, there are no such mechanisms. And so that stokes fear on the part of workers that their interests, their capabilities are not going to be considered. And so more of an interest in making sure that there's a vehicle.
Yeah. All right. Erica Grosjean, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us of Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations. We appreciate you.
The main focus is on the big three, but what are some of the economic sort of trickle-down effects that we will then sort of see broaden out to the rest of the economy?
Yeah, that's such an important point, because I think some people all over the country or the world, they think this is just a Midwest problem or a Michigan problem or just a factory worker problem. Or it's not. I mean, obviously there's impact everywhere. There's obviously on the auto side and the manufacturing side, you've got supplier plants that are sending parts to these assembly plants, and then the dealers, of course. But if the strike then goes beyond just the Detroit 3 in terms of the supplier base, it could start impacting Toyota and other transplants production. That impacts dealers all over the country, not just Detroit 3 dealers. Then there's all the other businesses you don't think of that really have nothing to do with the auto industry other than auto plant workers frequent these businesses. That could just be something as simple as the pizza joint or the bar where people get a dinner or a beer after their shift. That business just dries up. Plants are in communities. Obviously, communities have all sorts of merchants, schools, teachers, and whatnot. It's much more interdependent than people think.
And I think that's important context to add there, because as people are looking at this, and as we look at the proposals from Ford and from GM to the UAW here, I mean, the UAW is not going for it. And as you note, neither side has really a good reason to capitulate at this point. So where does it go from here? Who ends up blinking first?
Yeah, that's a question worth many tens of billions of dollars, because honestly, this isn't just about wages. I think it's important people understand that. Normally in a strike, it would just be probably about wages and maybe one or two other key issues. This is about many key issues, some of which I think you've got a graphic here on the screen. But the big ones that are a real problem are things like being paid 40 hours for 32 hours of work every week. That would require a massive headcount increase just to keep output the same, and then reopening the pension plan and reopening retiree health care. That is, per company, that is tens and tens of billions of dollars. And that's why you heard Ford CEO last week, Jim Farley, take the unusual step on live television to say, if we agreed to the 2023 demands 4 years ago, we'd be bankrupt now. I was really surprised he said it, but I think that's the magnitude we're dealing with here.
So then, David, when do we start seeing some of this action here show up in earnings? At what point will we start seeing that, given that it is still only day 4, but they're still very, very part on agreeing on this?
Yeah, and I do think the strike is going to last months. I mean, I very much hope I'm wrong. I hope they get an agreement as soon as this week, but I doubt they will. They're so far apart on so many issues. And then the financial impact here people always ask me, well, what about the inventory that is already there? How much stock do their dealers have? That's actually totally irrelevant from an accounting perspective for the automakers' earnings because they wholesale to dealers. So the moment that factory isn't producing vehicles, the moment it's not shipping vehicles, there's no more revenue coming in on the automaker side. The dealers, of course, have some inventory, but the inventory at the dealers is down across the Detroit 3 relative to the start of in late August of 19, relative to the 40-day strike GM had then. Inventory is 39% lower. It's about 46% lower at GM alone, but across the Detroit 3, it's about 39% lower. So we're still recovering from the chip shortage. So I've seen a lot of stuff lately about how it's actually good the strike is happening because inventory is getting too bloated. Those people are looking at day supply. They're not focusing on the absolute number. Inventory is still too low.
So then of the big three, in terms of who's perhaps best protected or who can perhaps survive the strike longer than the others, who's best positioned in terms of that and also the economic impact that it then has?
If you're just asking among the Detroit 3, I mean, the liquidity here is outstanding across all three firms. And I don't cover Stellantis, but they did have over 60 billion euros in liquidity, industrial liquidity at the end of June. I do cover GM and Ford. Both had really high liquidity at June 30. I think it's around 25 billion in automotive cash at GM, 29 billion at Ford, and total liquidity at GM and Ford combined is about 90.1 billion at June 30, with 51 some billion of that at Ford. So you have to do a lot of math here on how long can and you have to make a lot of assumptions about what's the minimum cash to run the automakers business, how long can they last, and then conversely, what about the UAW strike fund which was roughly $825 million at the start of this. Honestly, given the size of the liquidity here, I think the math is on the automaker side, but nobody wins financially. This is going to hurt very badly. It's just a matter of how long does it last.
And David, I want to ask you, because we had a guest on the show saying, look, if you're interested in buying a car, now is a good time before the strikes are even more prolonged. But then when you think of where interest rates are and seeing people start to default on their auto loans, and when you meant, of course, talking about inventory as well, is this a good time to buy a car? Should people perhaps hold off until after the strike issues are resolved?
Well, even before the strike, things were very expensive because inventory has been low and is still recovering from the chip shortage. Leasing is still way below where it should be. Before the pandemic went on, you were as high as low 30% in leasing. It's roughly 20% now of new vehicle sales. So there's just not much affordability. And yes, interest rates have skyrocketed very quickly. They're still way below where they were in the early 80s. But it's a very different paradigm, I think, for consumers to get used to, because we've been very spoiled since 2008 with these ultra low interest rates, and those days are over. Is it a great time to buy a car? I mean, I guess a dealer would always say yes to that. I'm not a dealer. Personally, I think you would probably want to wait until something works for your own budget. It just depends on everyone's personal circumstances, what they can afford.
I'm sure people will be tracking the action here and seeing if those strikes end up expanding to more locations. Hopefully they come to a resolution. A big thank you there. David Whiston, Morningstar's U.S. Autos Equity Analyst. Thank you for your time today.
Well, the United Auto Workers strike entering its sixth day with no real progress in negotiations. Now, the union saying that Stellantis' new contract offer lacks job security guarantees. And General Motors, as well as the other big three, really pushing back. We had GM CEO Mary Barra on Tuesday saying that the proposed salary demands made by the UAW were too costly. Now, both Stellantis and General Motors are set to lay off workers, citing that the strikes are a cause of this. Now, with the president of the UAW, Shawn Fain, saying that strikes may expand tomorrow if we don't see significant progress. Joining us now, we want to bring in John Nichols, National Affairs correspondent at The Nation. John, it's good to see you here. So some pushback from both sides. It still seems like the union and the big three Detroit automakers are very far apart on these talks, with the threat that the strike may expand tomorrow. How likely is that?
I think it's very likely. I don't expect that they'll have an agreement by tomorrow. I did note in the Stellantis statement and some of the other talk about the negotiations with Stellantis that there does seem to be some movement there, and there certainly are counter offers going back and forth. So these are real negotiations, and I think that it is within the realm of reason that you can get a settlement not in the too distant future, but by Friday. I doubt that very much. So I do expect that UAW President Shawn Fain will expand the number of plants that are striking.
Is it clear whether or not there are any concessions that are beginning to make themselves apparent as part of the negotiations?
Yeah, I mean, on both sides, I think you've seen some progress. The talk is that the companies in their counteroffers have upped some of their financial offers. The union has been flexible on some of this. Yes, they made a very, very big ask. I think understanding that they would step back from that to some extent. So I do think there's elements of movement, but there's still this real problem. And this goes beyond the finance. So much of the focus on this strike has been on the financials, on the ask for a big pay hike, the ask for a return or restoration of cost of living increases. But the other side of this is long-term job security and what will be done as electric vehicles are introduced to a much greater extent. Will those electric vehicles be built in union plants? Or will they be built in the north? Will they, there's all sorts of complex questions related to that. Even questions about battery production, how that will be done and who it will be done by. And all of that sort of floats behind any wage discussion. And I think those are some of the really tough areas to resolve.
John, when it comes to some of those sticking points and sticking with what you were just saying about EVs, given the fact that, yes, it's only been 6 days, but like you said, there does seem a high probability that we could see an expansion of the strike tomorrow. Is that going to delay EV manufacturing and the role that these big three Detroit automakers play within that space? Or how long, I guess, does the strike need to go on for in order to see that material impact?
That is a very good question, because you're focusing on exactly the area where I think everybody is concerned. It is this EV production, because of course you have Tesla and you have other companies that are getting rapidly into EV, and kind of every week and month that passes, that's a concern for the big three. That actually puts a little pressure on them to try and find some sort of solution to this. But it is also a complexity, because the making an electric vehicle requires a very different sort of assembly line, a different kind of work, usually requires fewer people, or potentially could require fewer people. And that's where the real deep struggle is here. And I do think that, it's funny that we just had a good discussion, or interestingly, we just had a good discussion about the writers' strike. The writers' strike dealing with AI, with new technology. There's a lot of that underpinning the UAW strike as well. And this question of, as the industry shifts, will it have a place for the number of workers and for workers in traditional industrial towns that have been there up to this point? That has not been really resolved at this point, and that's a big deal in this strike. It's a pressure on the companies, because they want to be in the midst of this EV rollout, and they want to be flexible, but they definitely don't want to be, fall back as production goes. But it's also something that for the workers is a huge deal. You have to understand that when you have negotiations of this kind, workers want to be at the table determining, or at least having a role in deciding how new technologies are applied and how they affect the industry. As in the writers' strike, so in the UAW strike, that's a big factor. And it's what kind of keeps these two sides wrestling and I think struggling to a large extent.
When we think kind of broad head count for the UAW and the amount of members that they represent, does the prospect of augmented intelligence or even more robotics within that daily manufacturing operation drastically reduce the amount of headcount that's necessary? And if so, how does that enable some of the auto manufacturers to say, okay, well, all in, we could be looking at roughly some of the same costs if we're looking at a lower base, and then at the same time still able to produce the same amount of vehicles?
Sure, this is getting into the heart of the matter, because when you move to these new types of production, the worker that comes into the plant may be dramatically more productive, literally helping to produce a lot more vehicles, but that individual worker can do it perhaps, on their, as an individual rather than as part of a group. So you are reducing the numbers. What the union has said is, look, there's a lot of things that you can do to address this. One is to go to the 32-hour week. And the 32-hour week allows for workers who are more productive to be paid at the rate they've traditionally been paid, but for a fewer number of hours. That keeps more workers in the plant. That's something that's a big priority for these folks. Another thing is the discussion about all of the parts and ancillary activities that relate to the electric vehicle. Who's going to be making the batteries? Where are they going to be made? There's a lot of work to be done in the electric vehicle rollout, and there's enough work for a lot of UAW members. It's just a question and part of these negotiations of, will that be done by UAW members, or is the company really looking for ways to offshore or at least to move to other places and not have UAW members in the game? That's what the union's very concerned about, and that's absolutely their responsibility. They represent hundreds of thousands of workers, and they want to make sure that those workers have a future, have something to do going forward. This is a question not just for the auto industry, but for industry in general. It's something that as a country we have to wrestle with as regards AI technologies, as regards automation, robotification. All of these factors are real tests for existing industries and frankly for the industries that come in the future.
John, certainly appreciate you sharing some of your research and insights around this. Nation Magazine National Affairs correspondent John Nichols, thanks for the time.
It's an honor to be with you.
If the UAW strike becomes prolonged, the effects could span out to industries outside of autos. Joining us now with the impact we could see on rail, we've got Jason Seidel, who is the Cowen Senior Research Analyst. So just kind of broad strokes, set the table for us here. What are some of those impacts that you're anticipating based on any correlations that we could see overflow from the UAW strike right now?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. So it's been a very tough year for the railroads. Volumes have not been what everyone has hoped for. We're down about 4.5% on the year. And ironically, autos have been one of the few bright spots. We have double-digit growth in automotive traffic for the railroads in 2023. So, if you take that away, you're adding over a 0.5 percentage point on the downward side, the total traffic for the rails. And so we are expecting this to eventually start hitting numbers. You're not seeing it yet. Because there's a couple-week lag in what you see in the numbers. The railroads already report on a week lag, but there's also some finished vehicles on the ground that they can still move as we head into the strike here. But a prolonged strike, you're going to really get an impact for the railroads, and that's coming with a backdrop of just everything else sort of putting pressure on them.
Yeah, certainly. And Jason, as we're speaking right now, we're just getting the headline crossing that today at noon, all GM, all parts distribution facilities here in terms for GM and Stellantis are being called to strike. When you take a look at where some of these locations will be, the strike for GM parts plants in Michigan, 2 locations there. Strike of all U.S. Stellantis part plants. That is according to sources here in terms of what we are seeing crossing Bloomberg right now. And Fain saying that GM Stellantis still needs some, quote, serious pushing. Now, they are continuing their strike against Ford, but they are not going to be expanding their strike with Ford. So, Jason, as we talk about some of the ripple effects and what you were just saying in terms of the lag effects that we could see for the rails, the longer that this goes on, how big of an impact could we see if this is a strike that lasts? We're talking 30 days, potentially 45 days, which is what we just heard from our last guest.
Yeah, we've already taken some of our numbers down yesterday to account for sort of the slower than expected traffic that we've seen and maybe some minor impacts, from the strike that we're seeing. Remember, total automotive exposure for the railroads is somewhere between 4 and 5%, depending upon the carrier. So it's not really large, but it's going to impact them, like I said. because, you're already in an environment where the railroads have their own labor costs are going higher. Remember, when the railroad workers were about to strike, they got ordered back to work by Congress, but that was the most expensive rail labor contract in history, and the railroads have been around for a while. So you have that flowing through on the cost side. Additionally, on the cost side, you've had some weather impacts here in the near term, and additionally, on the cost side, you're seeing fuel rise up. Fuel has sort of dropped from January to July, but sort of post the end of July, we've seen a big rise in fuel, and the rails get hit on that with about a 60-day lag on the recovery side. So near terms, the railroads have a lot of negative things going on, and unfortunately, very few positives these days.
Ticker-wise, as we think about the companies that you cover that are most impacted, that have the most exposure, who would they be?
So we cover the U.S. railroads, and we would say Norfolk Southern probably has a fairly large exposure on the automotive side, but they're all around the same area, and they're all watching this obviously very, very closely. But we think there's going to be a lot of pressure on the rail group. I think the sort of consensus estimates for 3Q need to come down as we head into the quarter here.
Yeah, Jason, this is coming at a tough time here for the rail group, like you were just talking about. When we talk about the risk of recession, the pressure that we could further see on volumes, on pricing, what do you see that looking like as we, not so much in the fourth quarter of the year, yes, it's so important, but even as we look out into 2024 as well?
Well, that's a great question, because, if you go back to June, I'd say a lot of the industry people were hoping for sort of a 1Q turnaround in what we've been calling a freight recession. We've seen weakness in the freight market sort of post-Thanksgiving of last year, and that's when it's really reared its ugly head. But going forward, now coming out of our global transportation conference that we just hosted in early September, people are looking at now the back half of next year. So the goalposts have been moved on the recovery, and we even talked to somebody the other day that doesn't think we're going to see a recovery till 25. So we're keeping a close eye on that. Clearly, my group is exposed to the economic whims. And it hasn't been a good thing thus far. Rails have actually seen a lot of freight move back to the highways because you not only had the fuel decline for most of 23 up until recently, but you also had spot trucking rates fall over 40%. So that's your number one competition. So there's been a modal shift away from the rails back to the highways.
Jason, when we heard the UAW president, Shawn Fain, say that members are ready to stand up to and against corporate greed, but also saying that reinforcements are coming. Could reinforcements also mean that other industries such as rail decide that they, because of the impact and the exposure that you're outlining and highlighting here, that there's some action that we could see from the rail industry?
Oh, the rail industry has a contract, so you won't see any strike action there. But the rails, like any other unions, the workers will not cross any picket lines. So you don't expect any of that. That's, to me, I was listening to one of the people that spoke before. That's not new news. No one's going to cross a picket line if you're a union. Same thing goes for any trucking organizations. But in terms of the impact, I don't think there's going to be any labor action on the rail side. Again, they just got a contract late last year.
Jason, how big of a risk are rising energy prices when you talk about the fact that there's some calls out there that we could see $100 here in the not too distant future? And I know it's something that's very tough to gauge. Obviously, so much of it relies on the supply that we're getting, obviously, out of OPEC here in the U.S., but then also the demand side of the equation, which kind of goes back to what you were saying before. So how big of a looming risk do you see that being here in the coming months?
Sure. For the rails, like I said, there's about a 60-day lag in the recovery in the fuel surcharge. So it is a definite near-term negative. But over the long run, if you took the rails and asked them in private, what do you look for? They would look for the highest energy prices without negatively impacting the economy, because the rails are about 3 to 4 times more fuel efficient than a truck move, depending upon the lane and the length of haul. So the railroads, I think, over time want fuel prices higher because it makes their product look a lot cheaper. And then when you start thinking about some of the ESG considerations and everything else, the rails also look a little bit better.
All right, Jason Seidel, always great to get your perspective. Cowen, a senior research analyst. Thanks for joining us here. Have a good weekend.
You too.
Nearly 2,000 GM workers in Kansas are idle today. GM saying that the ripple effects from the UAW strike are causing them to lay off the workers in Fairfax, while the UAW placing the blame on companies. UAW President Shawn Fain due to speak imminently. And for more on this, we want to bring in Al Root. He's Barron's senior writer. And Al, lots of focus on what we're going to be hearing from Shawn Fain, whether or not we are going to see the union expand its strike to more plants. What do you see as, I guess, how far apart do you see the two sides when you're comparing what the UAW wants to what has been put forward so far from the Detroit Big Three automakers?
Yep, thank you for having me. I feel a little like ESPN Adam Schefter. We got the cell phone. Shawn is just started speaking. So listen, what do I expect? I expect them to go out 3 plants. You didn't necessarily ask that, but so I would expect an expansion. What do they want? They want higher wages. They want to catch up for inflation of the last few years, but not only for the last few years. If you look at the auto industry since the credit crisis, since GM went bankrupt, I mean, workers have only got sort of 1% a year on average wage increases. Now they also get profit sharing, but that's not very good. So they want some catch up. And like we saw in the earlier clips, the automakers want to stop losing market share. They want to control labor costs as they make this electric vehicle transition. So it's a negotiation where both sides have some reasonable points, and then they battle it out like a boxing match.
Al, it's great to get your insight and analysis on this. You know, I just want to describe for our viewers a hot second the tone that is being delivered from Shawn Fain in this particular live webcast. You're looking at the UAW president right now. For those who have us on our side screens, as you do as well, essentially wearing black and white camo. He's got signs behind him saying UAW stand up, saving the American dream, record profits, record contracts here. This sounds like a UAW president that is in his own type of wartime mode. So what does that signal for the automakers, and whether or not they can expect any firm negotiations, any type of deal making to come to the table that actually nets out in their direction, or at least doesn't have them giving up as many concessions as previously intended?
What does it mean? I think it means buckle up. I don't think the strike is going to be over anytime soon. Wells Fargo, Colin Langan says 45 days is his base estimate. I would use about 30 days as a reasonable estimate. Shawn Fain, you talk about his demeanor, his rhetoric. He's done quite an interesting job here, right? He's striking all 3 at once. That's unique. He's going out in sort of a piecemeal basis that limits the impact on workers. It also limits the impact on the automakers. That's another reason it could be a long strike. He is turning into one of the more interesting labor leaders of my lifetime because of all the things you say. He's wearing camo today. He literally trashes the proposals from the U3 from the D3 automakers, which is sort of interesting. So I think he has people on the other side of the table frustrated and flummoxed. He's an interesting guy, but I think in general that whole wartime demeanor signals we're not done yet.
Do you see one side coming out on top, or is this almost a lose-lose situation for both sides? If Shawn Fain doesn't get what he wants, he doesn't get the support that maybe the union is hoping to see from the terms of an agreement that could be negotiated with one of the big 3 automakers. And then on the flip side, the automakers potentially being forced to pay more than they want in wages or some of the other benefits that the union's pressing for.
It's a great question. It's the $64,000 question. So we all know labor costs are going up. Now, UAW, about 140, 150,000 workers in the U.S. Work at the big 3. Total compensation bill is about $20 billion a year. That includes healthcare and pensions. We know that things are going up, so we're sort of arguing, are they going to go from 20 billion to 25 billion or 20 billion to 23.5 billion? So to some extent, and just for context, there's about 290 billion in sales between the Detroit 3 automakers in the U.S. every year. So we're arguing over 1 or 2 billion. So it doesn't have to be existential, right? So it's one of these situations where, if you don't want to get into the situation of fighting the last war, right? Like in a Panglossian world, they should be talking about how to take share, talking about how to grow membership. Maybe the UAW should be talking about how to unionize battery plants in this new EV world. But whether or not the union will be collaborative or whether or not the big three will be concessionary is difficult to say. That was the reasonable view. On the other side of that, I think no matter what happens, sort of both sides will declare victory. Almost any contract will be a record contract. So the UAW will always have that in their back pocket, but that's sort of the cynical view. What I think will end up happening is wages will go up, maybe faster than they did at, say, UPS with the Teamsters. We will all declare victory, and then we'll get back to the business of building cars.
Al, thanks so much for joining us here. We're going to let you go so you can listen in, and no doubt I have an idea of some of the stories that are going to be top of your radar in the near future here. Great to hear from you. Al Root, Barron's senior writer. Thanks so much.
Thanks, guys.